Welcome to Sabby Sabs podcast. I'm your host, sabrinasalvati. My special guest today is Alec Karakatsanis. He is the founder of Civil Rights Corps. He's also the author of the new book, Propaganda: How Police and the Media Manipulate Our News. Welcome, Alec. Thank you so much for coming on.
Thank you so much for having me.
So I'm curious a little bit about your background. Why did you decide to get into this line of work? Because I think that when we think about law, there's so many different avenues that people can pursue. Why was your focus on civil rights law?
I actually started my career originally as a public defender. And I think it was that experience that really made me see so many things about how the legal system was functioning and how the legal system is so incredibly brutal, and how so much of what it does makes no sense, is Kafkaesque, and is senseless, and the way that it was processing and that it continues to process the most vulnerable and marginalized people in our society through this kind of assembly line bureaucracy. I started to think, I want to attack this system more systemically. I want to create a legal system that is much more consistent with its own values. And I want to center my heart and soul and mind and energy with the most vulnerable people in our society and really fight back against the ways in which not just what's happening in court, but also the narratives that our society tells itself about what's happening in courts and jails and in communities across the country, about how that is leading to not just incredible injustice, but also lack of safety. And so I was really motivated by how so much of our criminal legal bureaucracy is actually not making us any safer at all. And I wanted to try to focus on those issues. So I became a civil rights lawyer and have been doing that work for over a decade now. And it's been really an incredible experience.
That's awesome. Yeah, I think a lot of people just don't understand unless they've been in the system or they have been a part of it. They've been a lawyer that participates in the system. A lot of people just don't understand how corrupt our criminal justice system can be. Now, your book, you're talking about how police manipulate the media. This is interesting. On this show, I've covered a couple of times how the State Department manipulates corporate media. But I'm curious to hear about policing. So this was the first time I heard about this. I didn't realize the police had an impact on the media. Can we talk a little bit about that?
Absolutely. A lot of people don't understand, and I personally didn't really have any sense before I started researching the book, of the extraordinary efforts that not just the police, because you have to keep in mind, this is a much bigger punishment bureaucracy. It's the police, but it's also prosecutors and prison and probation guards and officers and all of their unions. And then it's at every stage of the criminal process, there are multi-billion-dollar industries, like the money bail industry, which exists only in the US and the Philippines. There's the private prison industry. There's the industries that profit off of everything that happens in jail and prison. So medical care and commissary and phone calls and all of this stuff. There's a massive swath of our society that is profiting off of this. I haven't even gotten into all the surveillance companies and weapons manufacturers and construction companies and the people that make the tasers and the cameras and the guns. Anyway, so there's a lot of people who benefit from our society thinking that the way to reduce interpersonal harm and violence is through investment in punishment, as opposed to meeting people's basic needs. That's the fight really at the core, right? And what I learned is that there's also a multi-billion-dollar policing public relations industry. So you look at a city like Chicago. On the day that Chicago police murdered Laquan McDonald and buried and hid that video until Rahm Emanuel could get reelected, right? Until a judge ordered them to release it. They had 4 full-time public relations officers, okay? Today, about a decade later, as you and I are talking, Chicago police have over 50 full-time information manipulation officers, okay? The Los Angeles sheriff, 42 full-time employees doing information manipulation that we know of. LAPD has another 25, okay? NYPD has almost 90. So when you think about what are these people doing all over the country, what I explore in my book are so many ways in which we don't even think about. But like, for example, every single day, there's a million things that happen in the world. And the news has to decide which 8 or 10 or 15 it's going to tell us about and which ones we're going to ignore. And there's a bustling industry of people underneath every story you see deciding this is a story for you to hear. And these other stories, you're not going to get told. And they're also deciding who's going to be quoted in the story, how is it going to be framed, what language is used, who's going to be presented to you as an expert to help you understand the story. And a lot of this stuff is actually very sophisticated and planned at kind of the highest levels of the punishment bureaucracy. And that has an effect on everything that we see in the daily news.
This is very interesting. I didn't know that police had that. I really didn't. But now that you mention it, it makes a lot of sense. One of the things that I've told my audience before is that the police brutality cases that you hear about, that's just a fraction of the actual number. The media decides which police brutality cases they're going to cover. So while every major news outlet covered George Floyd, there were many other cases like that just was not in the media or was just buried. I interviewed a local resident here in Massachusetts who went directly to even the local news about police brutality incident here, and even local news would not cover it. And so the media really is the vehicle to get information out. And if the media is being controlled by whatever, factions, then that is going to limit the information that people have about said subject.
Absolutely. I think, it's important to understand that there were these uprisings in 2020 after the killing of George Floyd. But police in the United States killed more people in 2021 than they did in 2020. And they killed more people in 2022 than they did in 2021, and more people in 2023 than they did in 2022, and more people in 2024 than they did in 2023. So these problems are persistent. And what's really interesting, if you go through the historical archives of radio and newspaper and eventually television throughout the course of the 20th century, in every decade, 20s, 30s, 40s, 50s, 60s, you can find all of these articles about the systemic and rampant problems of police brutality. And you can find all these articles about the problems of jail and prison conditions and how prisons are warehouses for the poor. And there's all of these things, right? And yet the size and power of those systems has only increased. And we now are throwing people in jail cells in this country at a rate about 6 times our own historical average up until about 1980, and about 5 to 10 times other comparable countries. And we're putting Black people in jail cells at 6 times the rate of South Africa at the height of apartheid. So these systems are enormously resilient. And what I try to do in the book is I try to explain for people why year after year, decade after decade, we can be seeing the same problems. And what narratives are we being told about why the answer to all of these problems, including the system's own violence, is always the system needs more money and resources. That's always the answer we're offered. And I think it's a fascinating story to try to peel apart the ways in which, because I don't think it's as straightforward as saying, oh, there's this massive conspiracy and there's a few people deciding. It's a very complex issue. It has to do with who owns mainstream news media, but it also has to do with the ideologies and propaganda that even people that work in the media are subjected to, what they've learned and the ignorance that they exhibit, and also has to do with like the sort of news gathering process and the policing public relations industry. And there's so many things that are combining to determine the very biased and very distorted view of the world that we're presented in the mainstream news.
It's interesting, the numbers that you gave about the increase of police brutality cases under the Biden presidency. This is something that I tried to explain to people as well. And I think some people didn't believe it because they were like, well, I'm not hearing about this anywhere on any major news outlet. And I'm like, But ask yourself why. Ask yourself why now we're not hearing about the police brutality cases under, Biden's presidency as much as we did under Trump's presidency. So it would make people assume that there were more police brutality cases under Donald Trump's first term than there were under Biden's term. But the data shows that's actually not correct. And this is why I think it's so important that people do pay attention to independent media, right? Because we are out there explaining these things and hopefully covering some of these stories that mainstream media is not covering at all. What's interesting to me when I think about the media and I would say the police sphere, it's interesting that we usually see certain police departments on the news. Like we usually see the NYPD or LAPD or Chicago PD. And this is another narrative that people will have, is that all the crime is happening in the blue cities. But there's also crime happening in red rural areas as well, but the media doesn't cover it. Why do you think there is that focus where the media tends to zone in on a select few of police departments?
That's such an important question. And I think it's a very complicated answer. I want to say, initially, understand that answer, in my opinion, you have to understand something that I write about in the book called the volume of news and how to lie with the truth. Because these are two really important concepts that the book explores that kind of explain how we're being misled. And for example, crime rates are higher in Republican-controlled red state areas, as a matter of historical empirical reality. And that's because, for many reasons, but one of the big ones is the things that actually determine levels of violence in a society are big features of our society, like levels of inequality and poverty, access to healthcare. So one of the most significant drivers of interpersonal harm and crime is Medicaid expansion. The more you give poor people healthcare, the more you reduce things like police arrests and jailing and crime. We know that. Same with early childhood education. These are among the most important interventions. Same with reducing lead poisoning for children. These are all hugely important things. Same with just housing and et cetera. You could go on and on and on, right? It has nothing to do with policies of the police or whether a sentence should be 12 years or 9 years or 7 years. Like, those things have nothing to do with levels of violence in a society. It's these deeper features of society about whether people are getting their needs met. And so the volume of news distorts all of that. It distracts us from all of those things. So let me give you an example. A few years ago, there was you probably saw this viral video, tens of millions of views, of a shoplifting from a Walgreens in San Francisco. And a guy was on a bicycle and he escaped. It was actually kind of a cool shoplifting. I mean, he somehow got out the door on his bicycle. That one instance of shoplifting spawned 309 news stories in local and national outlets. At the same time, not a single outlet covered the wage theft by Walgreens from its own employees. Okay? Much larger set of crimes. Okay? So the volume of news affects what we think of as urgent and affects our subjective understanding of the world. They created a shoplifting and retail theft epidemic at a time when we now know from looking at the data years later, shoplifting was not up. And property crime generally was at historic lows in the United States the last few years. So, but with all these stories, it's kind of like, if you ask me about Michael Jordan, I could make you a video of every missed shot in Michael Jordan's career. It'd be 9 hours long of just him missing shot after shot after shot after shot after shot. And I showed it to you. You'd be like, if you'd never seen the NBA, you might think, oh my gosh, this is a really bad basketball player. He's missing all these shots. I've taken entirely true anecdotes, but I've put them together in a way that creates a false impression. That's what the news media does with crime. And that's what the news media does with crime in New York, in Chicago, in San Francisco. It's creating a false impression, not only that crime is always rising, and when in fact the last 25 years, crime has been down almost every single year, but it creates the false impression that somehow it's only Democratic controlled cities or progressive cities or cities with lots of Black people and lots of immigrants that where there's crime, which is completely false. But the building blocks of that are actually true stories, which is really important, because another thing I talk about in the book, the very best propaganda is based on true facts. That's how you really mislead people.
Because basically what the media is doing is they're basically selecting some true stories, but they're not reporting the others.
In a nutshell, that's the best way to mislead people. Because if you just reported stories that anybody could show are completely false, like, the photo was doctored or something like that, people aren't going to trust you. But if the stories you're reporting are themselves, they are true, and you're seeing real incidents of armed robbery or homicide or something, your defense mechanisms are down a little bit. And it's harder for you to tell that, well, wait a second, I believe murder is up this year because I've seen 40 stories on the news about it, when in fact last year murder was way higher, just the news did fewer stories about it. So I thought murder was lower last year. So it's very hard for the ordinary news consumer to have any understanding of the world when they're constantly being bombarded with these anecdotes. And it gives the people who are using the anecdotes tremendous power over what people believe about the world. So, I mentioned that people always think crime is up. Well, there's something really interesting about that public policy polling. People are much more accurate about crime in their own neighborhood than they are about crime in our society. Because the more your view is based on your own experience, the more accurate it is about crime. But the more your view is based on what the news is telling you about other neighborhoods or other cities or other states, the less accurate, because it's filtered through this mass media, which has all of these biases that I talk about in the propaganda book.
It's interesting when you talk about crime being up, because another report that I saw on both outlets, CNN News and Fox News, they were talking about the crime rate increase after 2020. But what they didn't explain is that, of course, the crime rate was significantly low in 2020, because what happened in 2020? We had the pandemic. There were a lot of states that were under lockdown. I know my state of Massachusetts here was locked down. So if we're locked down, of course, the crime rate was going to be significantly lower. But I sat there and I watched CNN and Fox News mislead their viewers into believing that, or not really mislead, but intentionally omit the information that it was significantly low in 2020 because of the pandemic.
So there's a couple of problems going on here. First of all, this obsession in the news media about whether crime is up from last month or last year, it ignores what the people who study these issues actually all understand, which is that you shouldn't be looking at short-term fluctuations in police reported crime. Like, on any given year, it could go up or down a little bit. That's not really the most relevant thing. What's important is to understand bigger, longer trends in society, so that you can start to understand that the actual drivers in a big way of levels of interpersonal harm are these root causes. Like I mentioned before, housing, healthcare, inequality, poverty, education, levels of isolation and loneliness in a society actually dictate whether people hurt each other much more than policies relating to the police. If people are involved in their community and there's places for young people to go play sports, do theater, do music, do arts, if people have good jobs, have safe places to live, if they're getting healthcare and treatment that they need, they don't hurt each other. That's why all these other societies that spend way less money on police, prosecution, and prisons have lower crime in the United States. So I think it's just absolutely essential for anyone, consuming the news to understand that it's very focused on June's crime numbers as opposed to July's crime numbers, as opposed to May's crime numbers, is itself meaningless. It's just propaganda designed to get you to think that short-term policy tweaks by the police or prosecutors are moving crime when they're not. It's very important to understand that. And then something that they did in the pandemic, like you mentioned, is instead of comparing comparable years like 2021 and 2019, right? Oh, they compared 2021 and 2020. And then, you can almost always compare one month to another month or 1 year to another year and find some kind of crime that's going up and some kind of crime that's going down. You can create a fear-mongering narrative almost anytime you want through the manipulation of statistics.
Yeah, and you mentioned like people having their needs being met. This is why when we look at the data for countries like Denmark or Germany or France, and this is not to say those countries have zero crime, but they don't have as much crime as we do here in the United States. And what do all those countries have in common? Like everybody, to your point, everyone has healthcare. Germany has free university. I mean, it's very different when you take care of the people and their needs are met. They're less likely to commit crime. Would you say that a lot of crime is connected to poverty in that sense?
Absolutely. So one of the most robust findings in all the literature is that levels of inequality and deprivation and poverty impact levels of crime. Now, we're using the term crime here, but I just want to point out, like I talk about in the book, there's lots of like crime that wealthy people commit that isn't thought of as crime, is not reported as crime. It's not, thought of as crime. And that's because, the police use terms like, law enforcement, because they want us to think that like a law is broken, a law is enforced. It's just objective. But in reality, people who call themselves law enforcement in our society are only enforcing some laws against some people some of the time in some places. It's why you have brutal, violent raids of the homes of poor families and Black families for drugs, when you don't see raids of Yale University dorm rooms for drugs or Goldman Sachs headquarters, or you don't see like undercover cops looking into like fraud at corporate accounting firms and what you just don't. Our society finds crimes where it chooses to look for them, and it ignores crimes where it chooses to ignore them. So even the concept of crime is obviously determined by who has power in our society. But even if you're to focus on police recorded crime, okay, or violent crime or sexual crime, those things are determined by these deeper features of our society. Like levels of sexual violence in a society have no correlation to policing. That's not why. And another thing you have to understand is most sexual violence in our society is between people who know each other. Most violent crime in our society is not perpetrated by strangers. It's by people who know each other. And that's a really uncomfortable fact for the policing industrial complex, because people understand intuitively that the reasons that intimate loved ones and acquaintances and family members harm each other are not because there's like not enough prison sentences, or not because there's no police officer stationed in their living room. It's because of deeper things like stress and environmental root causes and toxic masculinity and like all of these like features of our culture and our society. We know how to solve them, and other countries are doing a much better job at solving them.
What's the media's goal here? Are they trying to increase crime? Like when they cover certain stories, are they trying to? And I say this because I remember going back to the Virginia Tech shooter, right? I don't know if you remember this, but there was a young kid, student at Virginia Tech College, and it was a mass shooting. This was years ago. And the media decided to stop showing his picture because they didn't want to promote copycats. And they actually said that. So when the media is choosing to talk about these crime statistics and tell you crime is continuing to increase, when they select certain stories, particularly also about like police brutality, and ignore others, is the media trying to anger the American people? What are they trying to do?
I think we have to always understand that the motivations are not so simplistic and so straightforward, and that different people in the media have really different incentives and really different goals and really different ideologies, right? So I don't think there's like one answer to your question. I think it's a little bit more complicated with respect to different types of media. So the people who work at the New York Post and Fox News have a slightly different set of incentives and different goals as the people that work at the New York Times and MSNBC. And I think one of the most important features of my book, though, is I show how all of those people are serving very similar ends. They're all adopting and validating and normalizing and pushing far-right mythologies and misinformation and policies, right? But the difference is that any good propagandist understands that propaganda has to be tailored to the audience. So the way that Fox News talks about these things is a little bit different than the way New York Times talks about it, because Fox News is talking to largely conservative Republican kind of crowd. The New York Times' job is to get well-meaning progressives and liberals to support really harmful, unjust, completely ineffective policies. And so it uses a language of sort of progressive jargon and care, and it constructs a world of faux expertise and consensus and progressive values around a lot of these same discredited policies. That's one of the most important things that I show with enormous and meticulous attention to evidence and detail in the book, because I know it's going to be hard for a lot of people to believe the role that like the major ABC, CBS, New York Times, your local news, like people don't think of them as propaganda outlets or as like Fox News, but like you really have to, and that's why I spend so much time on the New York Times. Now, I will say a lot of my book could not have been done without the work of hundreds of journalists who reached out to me to help me build my archive. There's so many people in these institutions who do not believe in what the institutions are doing and who recognize how so much of it is misleading so many people for policies that are causing so much harm to the most vulnerable people in our societies. And so I think that the motivations are really complex. There's certainly some people at high levels at the New York Times that know exactly what they're doing, and for a variety of political and economic reasons have incentive to keep boosting, whether it's the military industrial complex or punishment bureaucracy or a pro-Israel agenda or whatever it is, right? Pro-pharmaceutical company, pro-private equity, right? Obviously, the ownership of these outlets, who advertises in them, affects, as Noam Chomsky and Edward Herman wrote in Manufacturing Consent, really determines what's going on with these. But there's also like a whole group of editors and reporters and people, producers who work at these institutions that aren't necessarily thinking when they go to work each day, I'm going to try to do this, I'm going to try to do that, I'm going to make sure that, we cover crime in a way that's going to mislead people. There's a lot of like failure to think critically about how what they're doing is contributing to this stuff. There's a lot of bad habits. There's a lot of ignorance. And so one of the most heartening things for me in doing this work on social media and then writing this book is how many people within all these news organizations, and then also how many independent journalists like you and others have reached out to me and said, oh, like, I hadn't thought about things this way. And I want to think about things a little bit differently. I want to develop a more critical understanding of this. And that's given me a lot of hope, because a lot of journalists, like even something simple, like journalists over the last few years organized within major media outlets to largely stop the practice of using mugshots of Black criminal defendants or people who've been arrested, because there was a lot of research that showed that just the constant mugshots on the news of Black people accused but not convicted of crimes by the police was having really terrible effects in our society that have been documented. So there's lots of victories like that, and so many more I talk about in the book that give me hope that like we can organize within the journalistic profession, especially with a lot of the new media and independent media that are sprouting up, to take a really different approach that's more critical.
Yeah, I totally hear where you're coming from. It's one of the reasons why I decided, I think it was like 2 years ago, not to show the actual police beatings or shootings like on my show, because it's tragic, and then also it can make people feel a certain way, you know? So I that was something that I did away with, where I wouldn't show that anymore. I would lead up to that and then say, okay, we can talk about what happened from there. I think it's interesting. The police departments, it's almost as if so they decide what the media is going to be able to cover, which incidents the media is going to be able to cover. Is that the case?
I was contacted by a local TV news anchor. I think his story is really perfect for answering your question. Okay. He contacts me and he says, I've been reading what you're writing, and I totally agree with you. And I've talked about it with all my producers and the other anchors and the reporters, and we don't want to be a part of this. We don't want to, but you have to understand the problem that we have. We are a small-ish news station, you know? We don't have a lot of money. In fact, like many local news organizations around the US, we've been divested from. We don't have like enormous funds. And the police make it so easy for us every day. Every day, they send us 14 stories. And it's not just police reports with the story. They send us audio, they send us video, they send us charts, they send us graphs, they send us people to quote, they send us experts to like put the stuff in context. And so as a news organization, we have to fill like 23 minutes of content at 6:30 p.m. and 7 p.m. and 10:30 p.m. and 11 p.m. and then again at 7 a.m. in the morning. And so faced with that kind of crunch, we end up putting on TV a lot of what the police are saying. And it's because in our local community, we haven't built up the pipelines of sources from, let's say, the people that are inspecting the playgrounds where your children are playing for lead every day, or the people that are in housing court looking at what all the landlords are doing to people, you know, refusing to install smoke detectors and rats and roaches. And like, it turns out what we've seen around the country is like, it's not that the public really demands and wants to watch stories about poor people and immigrants and Black people as criminals. In fact, like a bad landlord of the week segment is very popular. You know, a bad employer of the week who's stealing wages from their employees. People want to watch stories about like what local teachers are seeing in the classroom, what local nurses are seeing at the hospital. And it's just that those groups aren't getting paid massive public relations budgets to feed stories to the news every single day. So what I talk about a lot in the last chapter of the book is how lots of people from around society, including people whose families are going through the criminal system, can come together and organize and become organized sources of information for local news. And we can transform the kinds of stories the local news even hears about, and then the kinds of local stories that the news tells us about.
That's why I think it's so important for families that are involved to contact those of us in independent media. I know Status Quo, Jordan Sheridan from Status Quo News, he's interviewed a number of family members that have been in this situation where local media wouldn't cover it. So they contacted Status Quo. We've had people come on this show where they said local media wouldn't cover it. So we brought them onto my show. I think that's going to be the catalyst. Like, I really do think that independent media is going to be the answer to all of that. These stories that are not getting out, whether it's through local media, whether it's through the major corporate news outlets like Fox News, MSNBC, et cetera, there has to be another way for them to get their story out. Because I'm so glad you broke that down, what that local journalist told you, because what it shows you is that stories are being fed. And this also happens with the major corporate news outlets as well. And in fact, I remember this. I majored in broadcast journalism, so I went through a tour of like some of these major studios as like a class field trip, and they're reading straight from a teleprompter. So people have to understand that like Jake Tapper, Jesse Waters, like these people are not going out into the field. In fact, I'm trying to remember the last time I saw these networks have journalists on the street, like out in the field talking to the people. The stories are, sent to them, but at the end of the day, they are reading a teleprompter. So I think that's what people have to understand. That's why I don't call them journalists. But the older days of going out and getting that story, I feel like has come and gone.
I think that there's massive shifts happening in the news media industry. and in the political economy of news gathering. And there's so many more independent people now who are going out and actually doing journalism in their own community. For example, yesterday, Fiona Apple released a new song because she actually just spent years as a community court watcher. She and other people, including my mom, who retired from her job and then started watching court, were just observing what police, prosecutors, and judges were doing every day and writing reports about it. And like Fiona Apple released a song about all of the Black women in pretrial detention away from their children because they can't pay cash bail yesterday. And that's a result of her just being a community journalist. And that is something that is very uncomfortable for the mainstream corporate news, because people are taking into their own hands the task of informing their neighbors and their communities what's actually going on, because those local media outlets are not putting a reporter in the courtroom and telling people how many Black mothers are being separated from their children because they can't pay cash bail, or how many homeless veterans are being jailed just because they don't have a place to live in a society that claims to care about veterans. So these are the things that we see every single day, and that now all these community members are coming into court, because courts are places that have to be open to the public under the First Amendment. And you have a right to go in and watch what's happening, and you have a right to tell people about it. And it's really cool to see court watch programs across the country, because it's a way of getting involved with other people in your community.
I agree. Wow, Fiona Apple, I haven't heard of her in so long. Oh my gosh. I'll have to look into that. But yeah, I mean, and we need more of that, more people to capture what's happening in their community. Alec, are you doing a book tour? And if so, can you share that with us?
Absolutely. I'm doing a book tour. I'm kind of in the middle of it. I just want to say all the royalties to my book are donated to charity, to an incredible organization called the Stop LAPD Spying Coalition, which works with unhoused people in Skid Row in Los Angeles to stop police surveillance and violence. And so none of the money goes to me. And also, we have a fund set up, a charitable fund, so that we can give free books to anybody in prison and free books to any teacher who wants to teach the class with their students. So the goal here is very much to get the book and the ideas out there. And also, the book is for sale anywhere books are sold. So if you want to support this amazing cause, you can get the book. And I'm going, I've just gotten back from Oakland and San Francisco and Los Angeles and Atlanta. And now I'm off on Thursday to Seattle for an event, and on Friday and Saturday and Sunday in Portland. And then I'll be in Chicago the following week on the 21st of May.
Awesome. Alec, where can people go to follow your work?
People can follow me at Equality Alec on the social media platforms. And also I write a newsletter called Alec's Propaganda Newsletter. And that's where you can see the links to my book tour and the latest information there. And you can also follow our work at Civil Rights Corps, which, we're a small civil rights organization that's doing really incredible work around the country to actually fight these injustices as well.
Awesome. Alec, thank you so much for your time.
Thank you so much for having me.
Hey guys, this was a Sabby clip. If you like what you saw, hit that like button and subscribe.